record on this computer. There we go. Okay, so I'm recording now. What I'll do, there'll be nothing in this that it will be related to anything specific other than stuff that's in the public domain already. So let me go back to the share screen. There we go. Okay, so you should all be able to see the guide. I'm Rob Watson. I've kind of done stuff around community media for around kind of 10, 20 years. I've taught kind of media courses and things over the years. And I set up and ran Demon FM in Leicester back in 2009 now. So kind of quite a while ago now. So this is a kind of overall guide to what the key issues are in the Ofcom Broadcast Code. And it's really just a kind of an overview. For more detail, always go back to the Ofcom website and the information that's given on the code. And I'm happy to answer questions and help out as much as I can as well afterwards. There's a lot of slides, but I'll try and get through them as quickly as I can. And so some of it will be like skipping over it, but and there'll be bits and pieces that we need to go into in a little bit more detail. But it's just to give you the general tone. So the Ofcom code is a piece of, it comes out of the legislation that was brought into place for the Communications Act in 2003. It covers kind of standards in programming, and there's some relevant topics that we've seen in the media over the last few weeks that has brought the nature of the code to the forefront of some discussion, but I think it's really important and a valuable piece of legislation to ensure fairness and transparency, and that a wider, broad spread sense of impartiality within our media. It's known as the Broadcasting Code, and it's regulated by Ofcom, who are the national broadcasting regulator. It comes out from not just media regulation, but there's another couple of elements that influence the code, and things like the Audiovisual Media Services Directives from the EU that might change in the future. Things like the Human Rights Act, the Terrorism Act, the Equalities Act is something that's changed the code in the last couple of years, and things like the Official Secrets Act. Now, at the moment, there might be some additional regulations in terms of the lockdown and in terms of social distancing. So we've seen, kind of people being moved away from areas where large people have been congregating, that kind of thing. So there might be additional temporary situations that affect reporters and media content creators. So it's just sometimes just to keep double checking as we go along what is relevant at a particular time. And there's some issues that will come in particular focus and be relevant in different ways for different communities as things move forward. But the responsibility for the license, for following the license, is with the license holder. So that's the station. The person who's named on the form that you get from Ofcom is the license holder. And then the company or organisation that holds that license on their behalf, they in this particular instance, their word goes. They are God in that sense. So they are the ones who'll get into trouble. But then at the same time, everybody who opens a microphone and contributes to a broadcast programme is also accountable and responsible in this circumstance. So you have a certain privilege for broadcasting. It's not the same as being online for social media. It is very much a case of, we as broadcasters, we're in a privileged position and we have to act accordingly with that. The regulations define what it is that we should be considering, and it's Ofcom who adjudicates how that is understood, and if somebody infringes those regulations, what kind of sanction and why that sanction should be imposed. And it's really a question of following Ofcom. It's not there to tell you what you can and can't say. It isn't an impingement on free speech. It's just a a protection, if you like, against things that might be harmful or potentially harmful to the public. The presentation might contain references to bad language. I don't intend to. I'm not planning. The code covers things like sexualized content on TV services or radio. So just be aware that if you've got family members around, that you might not want them to be able to hear the gist of the discussion we're going to have. There's kind of basic points for radio which the code covers, and there's a set of kind of principles. One is accountability, so who is held responsible for what is broadcast and how it's broadcast. The second is, and perhaps we might argue the most important, is the protection of children and how under 18s are affected by our media consumption. Offence, there are debates and discussions about what it means to take offence to things, but this isn't subjective. This is clearly laid out and researched and understood and managed by Ofcom in terms of the way that they handle complaints. The idea of harm is that if there are any issues of harm that arise, whether it's criminal activity or antisocial activity that come out of what we're broadcasting, then a sense of fairness. Are we unduly promoting one view over another? And there's some prominent examples that have taken place recently. Privacy, and again, this is perhaps unwanted intrusion. This has been an issue in the media over the last few years with the kind of press intrusion, and newspapers aren't regulated in the same way that broadcasting is. Broadcasting has to abide by higher standards. Then accuracy, just to make sure that the information that's being put into the public domain is based on evidence and is based on the best evidence that is available within the circumstances. And then finally, is commercial communications. So where there's a clear link or relationship between commercial organisations and bodies, how that is clearly identified. Other factors that might influence what we need to understand is slander and libel in the courts. We can say things on a radio programme and it might not break the Ofcom Broadcasting Code, but it might land us in court if somebody takes exception to the basis that has been made. The Official Secrets Act, what kind of information is permissible or not. And then, as I say, emergency regulations in a period of crisis, that it might be, we're asked to vacate particular areas or not photograph in some areas during particular times, unless you've got specific press credentials and have arranged with the public authorities to make, to be able to do that. It's the responsibility of programme makers to comply with the code. Ofcom doesn't force you to comply with the code. You have to use your best judgment. But if you want further advice, the first stage is to talk to the station management team. If you've got, I don't know the structure of the team that you're working with, but to, talk to those people who've got experience producing content and assessing the editorial process and content. And really making sure that it's not just your own views that are being repeated, if you like. You have a responsibility to ensure that you've double checked where the views that you're discussing are coming from. Because you're not thinking, what Ofcom wants you to be able to do is, you can't fool the audience into thinking that what you're saying is irrefutably true. With the exception of matters of faith and religion, which has a separate section, which we'll cover later. But for matters of, if you like, public concern and public operations, then we should stick to the standard guidelines. So the kind of things that you're going to ask or would be asked when you're thinking about making a programme or contributing to a programme is, is there anything in this that can upset children? Is there any likelihood that it might mislead people? Are the facts accurate and presented as facts? And if there isn't 100% certainty about where the facts come from, have you got somewhere to go to where you can attribute the source of that information and present it in a way that there's a discussion that takes place between different viewpoints? And we see that a lot at the moment in terms of the discussion about different methods of understanding the spread of the coronavirus and what is in the public domain. If you're presenting that as a debate between experts and referring to those sources of information, you're on fairly solid ground to do that. But if you just, and there is an example coming up, if you just, kind of float in your own ideas, that you're not on such certain ground when you do that. Excuse me. There's a couple of rules of thumb. So just as you kind of starting a show, kind of thinking about what you're getting, thinking about what you're going to do, just ask a couple of questions. Is it clean? Is it uncontroversial? Is it honest? And is it fair? And if you can answer those kind of questions, I think you would be relatively okay in ensuring that your program is okay. So kind of like a green light on our highway code system, that you're fairly safe to move forward. If any of them you kind of question that and you've got an amber light, then you might just need to do a bit of double checking and reshape the program in the way that you might look at it. So, but it doesn't mean to say that you can't. We might look at this and say, what is controversial? It might be a controversial topic, and that's fine. Public discussion should cover controversial issues, but it has to do it in a way that's structured so that it ensures that that there's accuracy and no undue prominence to one particular view in the way that we cover those issues. Just as a kind of backup, Ofcom requires that every station has a tape or a data file, a recording, and you have to keep them for 42 days, even for RSLs, for short-term licenses. So you keep that handy, because they can ask for that at any point. And it checks if there's a complaint comes in within that period. After that period, they can't check, but if there's a complaint comes in about something, then they will ask for that, and they'll ask for an account of whatever took place, of why it was why it happened. And the worst thing that anybody can possibly ever do is try to alter or to kind of change that recording, because that's like the most serious offence that you can commit. And that you would never be able to hold a license again if you ever attempted to do that. So it's just be wary that in my experience, the best way to deal with an Ofcom issue is to own up to it as soon as possible and to work with Ofcom to come to a resolution about it. In the past, where things have got more stressed, it's when people haven't done that and they've kind of buried their head in the sand or pulled down the shutters and not dealt with Ofcom in that way. So it's when it comes to applying the code, Ofcom have to take into account a number of factors. So if there is a complaint made against a program or a station for a particular issue, then they'll look at the idea of how much harm and offence might have been caused. They'll look at who the audience potentially is for that program. They'll look at things like the expectations of the audience in terms of, the kind of, if you're running a particular kind of urban music program late at night, then you might expect a certain style of content, but how that is signaled to the audience is important. We'll cover this in a bit more detail later. And their main concern really is people who are unaware of the nature of a program's content being unintentionally exposed to that content. So it's kind of, it's as, in a way, it's kind of, they're looking for broadcasting to be universally accessible, so that everybody at particular times of the day, every adult, let's call it that way, would be able to listen to a program. And not particularly be offended or find it harmful. But if there are changes in the nature of that program and how you manage that change and how you signal that change to your audience is quite important. But underpinning this, excuse me, is a really essential principle about editorial control. And this is not about Ofcom having any editorial control over the content. You have the editorial control, and they want to ensure that you're not being unduly influenced by any other organisation. You're not being lent on by, I don't know, commercial organisations or local authorities or political groups in order to be able to shape your content, that you make your decisions and your coverage is free from from some kind of bias. At the point of the microphone, there might be other questions about that to be asked in another discussion, but that's for another time. I think one of the most complaints that Ofcom gets and receives is about offensive language. And Ofcom does a lot of research about this, and they publish the research of what the public thinks is the most offensive language. Excuse me. And so it's language that often other people might find offensive, but not everybody might find that offensive. So there are words that are used, for example, in the Muslim community, which in the general, if you like, white, I'm trying to pick my language carefully now, the general community, which might not have any reference, but within the Muslim community might have a particular reference. So it might be that those complaints come from different directions, that words and phrases, and I've got an example coming up in a bit where things change as well, our cultural values change, and the way that we express our terminology about each other, how we describe each other, those values change as well. And Ofcom does regular reports and investigations and surveys about how those values change in the public. And they expect program makers to look at that and keep up to date with what are the kind of current hot issues, if you like. If you want to find out more, and I'm a geek, so I find the kind of broadcast code one of those things which it's actually quite entertaining to read. Maybe entertaining is the wrong word, but it can be fascinating because it tells you what's going on in the industry, and they publish their reports usually on a monthly basis. So if you go to the Ofcom Broadcast and on-demand bulletin, you just Google search for the Ofcom Broadcast Code, it will bring you to this portal that they use to put their past decisions online. So you can go into some detail and look at how the program maker has been affected by different issues, both in television and in radio. So the broadcasting code it's open, it's transparent, and it's available to look at, at the track record of this. We might not agree with all of the decisions, but Ofcom does apply them in an open and transparent way according to the legislation that they're responsible for answering, conducting the investigations through. And they produce notes and files and guidance as well. So it's always worth looking at that. Right, so the Ofcom code, sorry if I'm rushing through this, but I'm aware that there are a lot of slides and it does take a bit of time. We won't go through every section. There are some sections that aren't relevant, but most sections we kind of really want to touch on. So there's 10 sections, and it's protecting the under 18s, harm and offence, crime, disorder, hatred and abuse, religion, due impartiality and due accuracy, elections and referendums, fairness, privacy, commercial references on TV, and commercial communications on radio. I'm not expecting there to be any elections in the next few weeks or months. If there was, then that would be a very astounding event to take place. And we don't need to concern ourselves with commercial references on TV because radio is managed slightly differently. I usually do a couple of questions at this point, but if you forgive me, I'll crack on. So it's might just kind of ask yourself, what was the rule of thumb, the 4 rules of thumb when you were planning your program? If you wrote them down, then that was great. As I say, I'll post some notes and make them available as we go along. So the first section And probably the section that, again, that gets, you know, kind of an awful lot of attention in the code is the protection of under 18s. And there's a slight difference in two parts of the code about under 18s and what's defined as children. Children are defined as people under the age of 15, but the code applies to people under the age of 18. So even though there might be that slippage area of, you know, kind of 16, 17, the code is still quite clear about what kind of content broadcasters should do. So on the one hand, it's what are the reasonable things that you do to protect people under the age of 18? Because children don't have the same kind of rights to freely choose things around them, things that they engage with them. They're not necessarily in control of the radio in a car, for example. They don't have the same right to change and to challenge. So they have a special role. You know, we have a special duty to protect and care for the under 18s. But there is a point at which the influence of children's decision-making process can be slightly loosened, if you like, which is when you be between 15 and 18. And it comes down to things like the nature of consent. So the duty is to protect children under the age of 18, and that the content in the program must be clearly identified. Now, one of the things with radio is there isn't a watershed. So there isn't a moment like there is on television when you can start to introduce, you know, more grown-up films, more grown-up television programs. You know, after the 9 o'clock watershed on TV, material started to get a bit more adult. I remember as a kid going to bed after watching TV, and, you know, kind of we go to bed, sharing a bedroom with my brothers, and we'd listen to the radio, and a late night talk show host would be taking phone calls, and it was very entertaining. And but they have to apply by this process that children might be listening. Maybe it's different now with our computers and our smartphones and things like that. So it's, our circumstances are changing, but broadcasting is still held, and I think quite rightly, by this higher standard of expectation. So there's no watershed on radio. We have to think about when children are likely to be listening, and as families, when you break your fast in the evening, it's a family event, and if the radio's on in the background, that can be quite late in the evening. So you might, you know, the programming that you put out, you might not be dealing with the controversial topics that you wanted to deal with at that point in the evening. Again, it kind of depends. It's not about the listener must beware. That's not how the code operates. The broadcaster must beware. So there are certain things that you just can't put into programs which are focused and dedicated for children. So you can't show a kind of, you know, like in a soap opera, you know, there's, you know, if you think of something like EastEnders, there's the pub and people drinking and probably smoking as kind of casual references. You wouldn't put that in children's programming or on a children's channel. Any kind of violence or dangerous behaviour, offensive language, sexual material, and things like demonstrations of occult practices and the paranormal, they're all precluded from children's programming unless it's part of an educational drama or something that explains the consequences of those actions and those issues. So it doesn't mean to say that they can't be included in a program. They just can't be casually included in a program for children. An example of two examples actually of where Ofcom have kind of clamped down, sanctioned is the phrase they use for playing of music with bad language in. And there was a station in Doncaster called Sign FM that played a lot of tracks that music tracks that hadn't been checked. And within an hour, a particular music mix had over 60 swear words. So if you're driving along in the school run to take your kids to school and you've got the radio on, there's, you know, kind of you don't have the power to, you know, to turn that off as easily as you would do if it's music that you've chosen yourself. The radio broadcaster has responsibility for what they're playing out and to check everything. An interesting difference between here and the United States is that when a radio edit in the United States does not mean that it's clean and free of bad language. It means it's 3.5 minutes long, and that it's been edited to fit the broadcast format in commercial radio in America, and not that its language is free of profanities and bad language. So just be wary if you pick tracks. You probably not, you don't do this through Ramadan, but it's just one of the standard things of the code to be aware that you have to make sure that the music that you're playing out has been checked. Section 2 relates to matters of harm and offence, and this is in some ways it can feel like it's subjective, but it's the way that Ofcom adjudicate on these decisions is to ask, what was the potential for harm in what was broadcast, and was it justified by the context? So there are some issues that we can talk about, and the issues such as offensive language, violence, sex, sexual violence, humiliation, distress, violation of human dignity, discriminatory treatment or language. There's a quite extensive list, and it doesn't just finish with the list that Ofcom mention, but in the context of a discussion of, say, domestic abuse, to be talking about that with somebody who is an expert and somebody who has dealt with the problem on a professional level, then the language that you might use might have to be quite graphic or quite blunt sometimes. But that doesn't mean to say that it's not precluded, because Ofcom's not saying that you can't talk about these things. It's just saying that you have to put it in the right kind of context and at the right time in order to make sure that it is sufficiently the audience is sufficiently guided that they could choose to listen to this discussion or not. So it's usually what they call signalling, how you inform the audience about what kind of discussion might be coming up. Within matters of fact, then there should be no material attempt to mislead the audience. And one of the things that was controversial recently, I think I've got a slide coming up in a minute about this, was the 5G mast thing. And they clamped down on this very, very quickly. There is no evidence that 5G masts have anything to do with the spread of the coronavirus. And the fact that some misguided people have gone out and vandalized and damaged those, some masts, some broadcast masts, put more people at risk. So that's the potential of somebody, giving way to harm that can have a material effect in terms of harm, because somebody is floating a view which is unsubstantiated. And there's an example that I'll show you in a second. So, that a discussion about that can still be justified by context, but you cannot try and pass off a set of views which aren't borne by evidence, if you like. So, programs which condone or glamorize violence or antisocial behavior, except when it's in a dramatic context and that the audience clearly knows that they're watching a drama. If you try to pass off, news as drama as news, which happens on occasions, you have to clearly signal to the audience that they know that they're watching a drama, because we expect a different type of resolution at the end of a drama. With a news program, we don't expect the same kind of outcomes, if you like. We don't expect, a happy ending at the end of a news story, for example. But so we have to be clear about what is identified as news and what is identified as drama. And the idea is that anything that encourages people to copy such behaviour, which could be meaningfully harmful to them. And we've seen this as an issue with self-harm. So the social media platforms like Instagram and Facebook have worked over the last few years to take down self-harm sites because they were kind of clearly causing more harm by people having access to that material in the first place. So when it comes to broadcasting, again, the topic can be discussed, but probably best with a healthcare or kind of counsel, a healthcare professional or a professional counsellor, or somebody with some or from somebody's personal perspective after they've been resolved. But to glamorize or to in any way kind of suggest that any kind of violent behavior or is to be condoned is very quickly frowned upon within the code. Likewise, you can't show again exorcisms and the occults again. That's a particular passage in the code. Things like hypnotic techniques. Now I know there's Channel 4 have I can't remember the guy's name. He's a famous hypnotist and things like that, and it's very entertaining, but it's presented as entertainment, and people have consented to them being part of the program, and it they've signed up to it in advance, and they do it for entertainment value. So it's clearly put into the context where the audience knows that this is being responsibly managed. In terms of things like competitions and voting, there was a scandal a few years ago now where phone lines were, kind of premium phone lines were being used by commercial radio or radio stations, and nobody had any chance of winning, and nobody had any chance of actually finding, influencing the vote, if you like. It was a fix because the stations were just using it. And one classic example is if you're not doing a live program, don't ask the audience to call in or send a message in and influence what's going to come up next on the playlist. If you want to play a particular song or a particular issue to be discussed, and you're not in the studio because it's pre-recorded, then you have to just be clear. You can say quite easily, this is a discussion that took place earlier. If you want to leave a message on our message board, we'll get back to you when we're back in the studio, that kind of thing. Just don't try and pass things off that the audience would be misled about, and particularly when it comes to votes and competitions and things like that, and you kind of don't change the terms of the vote or the poll as you go along. It has to be clearly defined in advance. So one thing I mentioned earlier was about the change in values of words, and in the 1960s there was a popular song by a group called Blue Mink and the Melting Pot, which is very popular with a certain generation. I grew up hearing it on the radio, but if you look at the words now, and it is, I'll read it out. It says, Ofcom says that some of the lyrics, including yellow chinkies and coffee-coloured people, have the potential to cause offence, and kind of our values have changed, I hope. And whilst the song has a particular merit in terms of the expression of togetherness, it has to be put in a context that says, our language has changed about this in the present day. I've just got a message from Yusuf, so I'll reply to that. How do we deal with live calls and what the caller may say is factual or not, and maybe just in their or maybe just their opinion? On a phone in, handle slightly different, because what you're doing is you're inviting members of the public to come in and to express their opinion. But the job of the presenter of the phone is not to go along with that opinion. It's to challenge them on their opinion, or to present an alternative opinion. And to say, and if you listen to a station like LBC, what they do is they have, James O'Brien is pro-Brexit, but they have Jason Rees-Mogg and they have Nigel Farage on the station. So you kind of almost pick and choose who you want to be, abused by on that kind of shock jock kind of thing. Now, I'm sure that's not the model of broadcasting that you intend to engage in. But they have a particular way of managing that. Usually what happens in a phone in is you'd ask somebody, well, where did you get this information from? Why are you just believing these things that you're reading on YouTube? Did you check it with any other kind of verifiable source? Who have you spoken to about this? And I think it's a question of, you don't have to aggressively or antagonistically challenge people, but we have views. We all have views and opinions, and some of those views might be valid. They might be slightly misplaced, but they might be valid. And to engage with people. But if it is, we haven't seen any, I don't know what it's like near you, but in Leicester, the sky's been clear of vapor trails recently. Now, there is a whole conspiracy theory about that, but it's based on no evidence whatsoever. So to just give people an opportunity to open up and make claims that aren't justified is problematic. Hope that kind of helps. I think this is a particularly, each section is important to the code, but this one has some particular relevance for the changes at the moment. And this is crime, disorder, hatred and abuse. So the principle is, in this section, is to mitigate or reduce material that's likely to encourage or incite the commission of crime or lead to disorder. So if you can imagine at the moment, we're getting pretty frustrated with the lockdown, and everybody's experiencing this, and you go onto your radio program, and even as a joke, somebody says, I know what we should do. We should all go to our local supermarket, and we should do those things where the cars do all the spinning, and we should meet up for a car meet and do the and we should race around in our cars. That's inciting disorder. Not only will you get a reprimand from Ofcom from that, the police will come knocking at your door. If I wanted to organise a protest here in Leicester to go and kind of stand outside the town hall with placards and banners, I could not do that within my radio programme, because that's an incitement for somebody to do something. If I wanted to talk to and discuss with the campaign and protest groups who are doing that, that's legitimate, as long as I get the local authority or the public bodies who are affected by this to put their point of view as well. So as long as you do it in a balanced way, where you give each side of the argument an opportunity to come back and present their side of the story, then that's fine. But what we don't do through any kind of casual reference is, a common one, for example, you might have a guest comes on, and it's widespread in our society with smoking of cannabis. It says, I kind of, it's cool, man, to have a spliff, blah, blah, blah. Well, you've got to be careful about things like that. As a presenter, you might probably, I would imagine you'd want to challenge that, because particularly if children are listening, because it's illegal. So it's where things get normalized. It's where things get kind of actions get taken as normal. That's what Ofcom want to kind of keep things within the law and within civic order. So we don't do anything which would specifically lead to the commissioning of a crime. And we also don't do content which could amount itself to a criminal action. So kind of revealing private data, or, kind of revealing access codes and things like that. That's kind of, a criminal offence in itself. And the other one is incitement for terrorism, and kind of any civic disorder. Hate speech is also clearly regulated, and I've got a couple of examples which kind of best illustrate this in terms of how that's managed. So the reference to terrorism is defined by the Terrorism Act. And it's anything which is perceived to be threatening behaviour against the public authorities or groups of people. Hate speech is defined as all forms of expression which spread, incite, promote, or justify hatred based on intolerance on the grounds of disability, ethnicity, gender reassignment, nationality, race, religion, or sexual orientation. And they're the protected characteristics that are enshrined in the Equalities Act. So that was one of the things that updated the legislation in 2010. A crime is anything that may be punishable by imprisonment or a fine. Even, I suppose at the moment, let's all go and sit on the beach. Let's all go meet up on the beach. It'd be great. People are getting spot fines. The police have emergency powers for that. So we have to be careful about, when we talk about meeting up, that we're not breaking the temporary legislation that's in place. It feels like a kind of minefield. This is a very extreme example. And it happened in Sheffield a couple of years ago, 2017, where a station broadcast material that they'd taken off the internet, off YouTube, and they didn't check it. and they didn't double check to see if it was, and it was, he was actually dead at the time, he'd been killed. It was a quite radical preacher who was extolling terrorism, basically. Now, the problem, why the reason that the license got revoked, it was not necessarily because of the material that was played out. It was the fact that the people at the station just refused to engage with Ofcom at all. So, this is an extreme example of where somebody didn't follow that basic rule of thumb of controversy and the ability to check things. The rules on hatred and abuse really are about protection, and that is, it would be in a sense of social solidarity that we don't wish to be treated in an offensive or harmful way. So why should we expect other people to be able to make derogatory comments of the group that we belong to, or just because of our faith or our religion? And again, except where it's justified by context. So in something like a drama program or a serious journalistic investigation of matters. I know no kind of matters of representation and identity are matters of public concern, and they should rightly be discussed. But we don't kind of just launch in. We don't allow people to express bigotry, I suppose, is the easiest way to describe that. A couple of examples related, again, Ofcom. One was a TV station. I think they were both TV stations, actually. One where was a sermon was carried on a particular TV station where there was a call to treat gay people in quite a derogatory way. And another station which looked at kind of a kind of long running, if you like, dismissal of Jewish people. So we can expect protection from the law, but it has to be equal. And to have the freedom to operate and share our views, we also have the responsibility to make sure that we're not doing that in a way which is hateful or contemptuous of other people. This is the section which kind of has, I'm sorry about the time, it's kind of trying to get through as quick as I can, but I'll kind of try and speed up a little bit as well. This is one about, kind of religion and the proper approach in religious programming is really to not exploit people's susceptibilities. So the kind of claims, I heard the other day, I was actually chatting to somebody via Zoom in a meeting who was from Los Angeles, and they described how faith healers are claiming that they can claim people of the coronavirus through their televisions. You would not be able to do that in the UK because it gives a sense that somebody has powers beyond now the power of faith, the power of prayer are individual matters and community matters. But to put that in a broadcast context and to make a claim that can't be substantiated is treating the audience in a way that they are being held susceptible to false claims. Likewise, programs can't involve any abusive treatment, as we've kind of just seen. But programming can be of a religious nature, and that can be the central part of the program, as long as it's clearly identified. And I think, the station, here in Leicester, it's Ramadan Radio. If you're tuning in and you're expecting material which is not of a faith-based nature, and you hear regular jingles and references to the name of the station, that's your choice to stay and listen or to listen to something else. And, you are allowed to discuss, everything about the faith that you profess. But as long as you do it in a way which isn't abusive, or you don't treat anybody as lesser in that respect. So you just clear with the audience, and you're not trying to promote any views by stealth. However, one thing that you can't do on television is seek recruits. But you can on radio. You can openly ask people to come and join your community. So that's something that radio can do, which is a difference from what we can do with television. Impartiality and accuracy is quite important, because it's about how we relate to stories that are in the news and how news is identified. So there shouldn't be any overlap between anything that can be related to as comment and anything that's related to as news. That's why most radio stations have news that's identified by a jingle and spoken by a newsreader. That is the news, and there's no sponsorship in that. There's no opinion expressed in that. All of that comes in the discussion programs that follow or wrap around that. And politicians can't be newsreaders. But it's important that issues that are of controversial nature, and there is a lot of controversy. We've lived through a period of time where our politics has been very controversial, but it just means that you have to be unduly impartial. What they call due impartiality, and duly accurate in the way that you present that information. So what you're not doing is just sticking to one side and being biased towards one group. But Ofcom actually does take the view that you can do that across a range of programs. So as I said before about LBC, they have strong views pro and anti-Brexit, or had views pro and anti-Brexit in their programming, but the audience was signalled and clearly understood, we're told that, you might get a better reception for your views if you're one side of the debate by talking to one of our other presenters. And they manage the question of balance through their programming. The question, by and large, in radio and community radio, you have to try and be balanced within the program as much as possible, and clearly separate out what's a personal view and what's an exception, an individual view. And the example of that came up recently was, you might remember Jon Snow had said he stood in Parliament Square outside Westminster saying, he'd never seen so many white people, and Ofcom said no, that was an objective fact. That was, the complaints that were raised about that were dismissed because, as an experienced journalist, he was expressing an objective point of view, which was verifiable. The other example that I found was a community radio station that basically did an advert within the news. Latest news, Sainsbury's or Morrison's, I think it was, are doing a breakfast and it's a reduced price. You can't put anything like that commercial sponsorship within an advertising within news. That's kind of really frowned upon. This is the issue that kind of came up recently. There was a community radio station in Uckfield that carried a program about 5G technology and the origins of the coronavirus, and they Ofcom quickly adjudicated on this decision and came down on it very, and it came down as an immediate, if you like, slap down to broadcasters. And you might have seen this, the Eamon Holmes on the ITV morning program kind of being similarly kind of slapped down. They need to protect the network. And there is no evidence of, this was a person who was passed off effectively as an expert when they had no expertise in this topic. So, be careful who you bring on as an expert. Double check their credentials. And the real, the kind of background about that really is to make sure that the audience isn't misled by the so-called expertise that there's being offered. We don't need to cover elections and referendums. Fairness is really about making sure that the audience understands the nature of a program, and that there is no unjust or unfair treatment of any individuals or any organisations or groups within that program, and that they're fairly dealt with. So if, for example, there is an issue of public controversy, then it might be the case that you have to invite, if, for example, at the moment, I imagine an issue of public concern will be burials, and there might be, delays, or there might be concern about delays. And okay, that's a legitimate thing to have people talk about that, but invite the public authorities on who are responsible for that to put their point of view as well, so that they can explain, got the opportunity to explain. Now, if they do that badly, That's their responsibility, but you gave them the opportunity to explain what was going on. So you just kind of, you're dealing with the issue in an even-handed way. Likewise, people should expect to know what kind of their contribution is going to be to a program. So if it's going to be a discussion, there was an example of a case where somebody took part in a discussion and it was later edited and it bore no relation to what they thought they were taking part in. You really, you know, that's the kind of stuff in broadcasting which is frowned upon. The press might do that, but the broadcasters can't do that. So give the contributors an idea of what kind of questions they're going to be asked. You don't have to give them the specific questions. And I'd suggest as well, you take the view that you're not a breaking news station. So you're not, you know, kind of doing an interrogation of somebody. You know, you're not Jeremy Paxman or somebody like that. And kind of if there's any contractual rights that are at play. So sometimes you get a lot of the big problem at the moment is there is a lot of controversy about the people that the BBC and the TV stations invite on to be, you know, kind of pundits.
Rob, we've lost your voice.
Have you lost my voice? How come you've lost my voice? Am I back? Is it there?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm mouthing the words, but nothing's coming out. The contractual obligations that people are under. So we have these pundits that turn up on TV, and they're being paid by PR organisations or big companies. And there is an argument that the BBC particularly are not being transparent and not being helpful to the audience in terms of how that is signalled to the audience. So that's an issue I think that will come up appropriately. Tia, you wanted to talk about mental health. Yes, it's okay to talk about, one of the guiding rules for discussion, it's fine to talk about how people are experiencing situations or how they feel about it, because that's their experience. That's legitimate, as long as they don't run off. So there was, for example, there was a tales that went through social media really quickly the other week. If you go, then the hospitals are just not going to be treating anybody. If our older people go in, they're just going to be left to die. It was all false. It was all fake news. It was all misinformation. So if somebody has those anxieties, then you probably need to pre-screen them before they go onto the program. But if somebody's talking about, I will talk about this openly. I have my anxieties from moment to moment. Some days are better than others. I think the role of radio is to help people share and discuss those kind of things. But, we just have to do it in a professional way, I suppose. And if you've got a background in that, then that's even better, because you've got the professional experience to be able to encourage people to open up about some of these issues. So yes, we should be talking about it. We should be talking about it freely, but just remember, we don't want to let people off the leash to talk about, particularly if they're vulnerable. And that's another part of the process of this, of protecting vulnerable people who might not be able to control themselves, if you like, because of their anxieties. And this comes under things like privacy. So we don't do things like, we don't disclose where people are from without any kind of permissions, and particularly children under the age of 18, they don't have a right to automatically take part. So you need to get things like permissions from guardians or parents for them to take part, unless there's a clear public interest. And at the moment, the consent that is needed. We've seen TV news reports from inside hospitals and ICU wards, and that has been very carefully vetted and managed by the broadcasters and by the hospitals themselves and by the people and the families involved. So it's a slow process of making sure that people have consented to that. So just walk in with a microphone or a camera and just take pictures, as somebody might do, hanging around the ambulance station leading into a hospital, that would get you in trouble because you're not respecting people's privacy. But things like phoning calls, people are deemed to have given their consent. If you get in contact Now, this might be interesting where you're following a chat on social media. I'd suggest that if somebody specifically messages you to the thread and says, I have a point, or regarding that, like I've just done with Tia's message, that is consent to relate to that. If somebody's just watching and they're just, kind of observing the discussion, I wouldn't regard that as being enough consent unless they specifically identify that they want to contribute to the program. A phone call in or a Zoom call or a Skype call is assumed to be consent into a discussion. Just be aware again that sensitive places in public places at the moment has probably changed and is different than it was just a few weeks ago. So double check there. We're aware of the time, and I'll try and get through the last few sections. We've not got too much to go through now. Watch out for people who are in a state of distress at the moment. And then any kind of relatives and victims of any issues that are around at the moment. Just be sensitive to that. I won't share this example, but I'll put it in the notes for it. Commercial references are really kind of making sure that any kind of commercial reference is transparent to the listener. So, for example, if you were running a program about financial advice, then you might, if you have a guest on who is from a financial firm, you can relate to that person's firm, but if they've sponsored you to produce that firm, that should be clearly signaled to the audience. And it's probably best, it's probably best to show who that person is in their advertising. If they're doing it for free, that's fine. You can say, that's not a problem. But don't try and pass off somebody's sponsorship or commercial arrangement with the station as if it's free. You cannot do that, and I'll show you an example in a second that shows that. Spot adverts, those 30-second adverts, they've got to be separated from the programs, and there's no advertising around news. And there should be no suggestion that any services that a contributor to a program has to pay for to get further advice. So those premium hotlines, that kind of stuff, to find further advice about this, and you ring a number that it should be free. Free to your listeners, and it's they should know, or if there is a cost, they should know what that cost is up front. When it comes to fundraising, you can act on behalf of a fundraiser and you can appeal for funding, but on the basis that for the broadcaster, this is a free of charge service. So you might have a relationship with a fundraising organisation, but in terms of that fundraising, you're offering that as a free service. That fundraising organisation might choose to take sponsorship or advertising with your station, and you can raise money through that sponsorship and advertising, which is clearly signaled to the audience, to the listener. But if there's any kind of discussion about fundraising matters, think of it in terms of a few years ago, Oxfam got into trouble, and some of the big international organizations, there were some scandals about it, and they had to, people have to be able to question the charities and the campaigns that they're contributing to. We've seen some controversy in the last few days about the giving channel, the Virgin giving channel, about the amount of money that they take to administer public appeals. So they're matters of public controversy. Transparency is what solves those problems, is be clear with your audience. But you can raise funds, and you should, and at the moment, we should be raising funds. On the example I've got for passing off interviews or discussions was LBC. I don't know why I'm mentioning them so much these days, but they got into trouble because an interview that they did with somebody from Bupa was actually paid for, and that's a clear breach of the regulations. Last couple of slides. What to do if something goes wrong. If Ofcom get a complaint, they'll want to know what happened. They'll ask for a recording. They'll ask how did the situation arise, and they'll ask if it was a predictable thing or was it planned in advance. And they'll ask what kind of, if you're stood out in the street doing a vox pop and it's live and somebody walks past and shouts a load of abuse, did you take reasonable steps to make sure that a random member of the public couldn't do that? They're the kind of questions that they'd ask. What is in your power to make sure that you, I mean, on Zoom at the moment, there's a lot of anxiety about the security settings. Are your security settings locked down so that they can't be hijacked and Zoom bombed, I think is the phrase I've seen it being called. So just make sure, have you taken reasonable steps and precautions to ensure the security of your broadcast feed, and your guests are properly briefed about what they can and can't do. Then Ofcom will want to know what you did with the presenter, what kind of training you've had, and you'll all be able to say that you've attended an online briefing about this. And really, so if there's a problem in your station and in your program, just double check with your station manager and your program team, just to say, kind of, was this a problem? And if it is, correct it as soon as you can, kind of put out an apology, or, update the information as quickly as possible. There's a checklist that I'll share, and which is kind of what you might want to do before you go on put your program together. You've got that kind of those 4 rules of thumb, but there might be some more, kind of public controversy, children listening, any reference to private affairs of individuals, that kind of stuff. What steps are you taking to mitigate any of those issues? And then afterwards, you might ask yourself, did anything in the program cause alarm? Did anything on this feel like it? The program that you've been involved in, was it clearly identified? Was it transparent? Was the information reported fairly and objectively, and the sources of information given appropriately? So back to the rule of thumb, and only a couple of slides to go, literally. So the rule of thumb is it clean? Is it uncontroversial? Is it honest? And is it fair? And if you kind of can answer each of those questions, then you pretty much should be okay.
Rob, I have to interrupt very quickly.
Yeah.
As a presenter, I'm going to obviously try and be as clean as I can. But however, my guests may not be, or may say something controversial. I'm referring to more children. How do I deal with that? And how responsible am I going to be?
I think let me stop sharing the screen. I think the way to do that is to just be clear with the guests, first of all, that they know that it's a family program when you're inviting them on. If it's a particular time and you have there are issues that you're trying to discuss and broach, which might be considered controversial, and some communities view different topics and discussion. So, for example, issues around gender and sexual identity in the general population might not be considered as being so controversial, but in some Muslim communities, it can be highly controversial. It's how you signal that to your audience and how you signal how you will manage that with your guest. Now, if you're just taking random phone calls from anybody, the telephone systems that the radio stations have in place are usually manned by a researcher. They brief the respondent before they go on. They have a delay system, and that they block people as soon as there's something like 20 seconds, and they're listening ahead, and then they block somebody and say, "Oh, we've lost them. Where have they gone?" Because they heard this tirade of abuse that came out. So it happens all the time. That's the nature of live phone-ins. But I'd suggest at the moment, given I don't know what technology and what equipment you're using for that, you err on the side of caution, and you're inviting people in to speak, and you just give them a quick brief to say, look, this is family stuff, or we're managing this in a particular way. If you're not happy with that, don't contribute to the program. Does that answer that question for you?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I think mine will be a family show. It'll be kids calling in, reading stories, whatnot. No, I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, and again, it's just the question on that one is consent. So just making sure that the children who are taking part have got consent. And it would be, in the present moment, this is one of the few ways that children have got to access a kind of shared social community experience. And what other, what other broadcasters can do this? So we have a duty to protect those children and make sure it's done in I don't want a safe space. I know can be a controversial way of saying that, but let's create a safe space for our children to express themselves, and that comes through from I hope from all of the broadcasting that takes place on your station. So a lot of these things I think are the worst examples. rather than the best examples. Sometimes we focus a lot on the negatives. So Tia's asked again, so what about health information on a website? It's health information. I think probably you need to have a policy about who you refer to for health information in terms of Public Health England, NHS, government, World Health Organization, those kind of reputable sources, your local authorities, that kind of thing, your local health authorities. If it's images of children, again, clearly with the consent of the parent or guardians, and nobody can be forced to share their image. GDPR, data protection, that kind of thing, equalities legislation means that we don't have to. We live in a very visual culture, but this is radio, and I know there's a crossover between. This is like a live chatting show with chat here. It's great. I've never done this before. Drawings, fine. Drawings are fine. They're great. Drawings are brilliant. Get children to send in drawings, as many as them as you can get, because they'd look amazing, I think, to see. We've got this hybrid situation at the moment where we've got this crossover with with social media and with radio. And everybody's been forced to suddenly change how they do radio, which should have taken us 10 years. What we thought we were going to be doing in 2030, we're doing that now in a month, and we're having to change and think on our feet. And one of the difficulties with this, just remember that Ofcom, whilst you might be referring people to different sites and different feeds, that information, you will have checked what those sites and sources of information are. So Ofcom would consider that you've done, if you like, due diligence on the points of information that you're sending your audience and listeners to give them further advice, and that itself is safe, and it's not being sent to sites which have kind of adult content if it's a children's site, that kind of thing. Okay, I've gone on for much longer than I intended to. I don't know how. Let's check my gallery view. So there's a few people still here. That's great to see. What I'll do is I'll email over the slides and the sheets and the check sheets. Has anybody got any other questions that you wanna ask? If I'm happy to hang around for a bit longer. I know it's been a bit of a long call. It is quite detailed.
Yeah, Rob, I've got a question.
Yeah.
We're doing me and my co-host are doing a parenting program. So we're just sharing some good parenting tips on our program.
Yeah.
That information is coming from a training program that me and my co-host went to 18 months ago. Would it be okay for us to use some of the information from that in terms of some basic tips? It's like an introduction type program.
There's different levels to answer that on, in terms of your parenting expertise is your expertise, but don't try and pass that expertise off as professional expertise. You're just an ordinary parent, and these are the kind of tips that we've accumulated, common wisdom, if you like, community wisdom, and I think that's a really important thing that we should nurture. If we then suddenly say, well, actually, this has been verified by people at Oxford and kind of experts, and it's peer reviewed and things like that, and it hasn't, then we have problems then. Likewise, I think one of the issues around some topics about parenting can be controversial, and values change, and we've seen that legislation has been brought in Scotland and Wales about smacking, and it's really just making reference to where these things have been discussed, and you're not just promoting unduly one side of that debate. So you're acknowledging that there are other views out there, and if you can't get somebody to participate who takes that other side of the view, if you like, then you might, to have that discussion, you just refer to stuff that maybe people have written about or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
It's the kind of balance thing, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
But most of that probably rests on common sense. But then again, what is common sense at the moment? It's cool. Right. Okay.
Hey, Rob, I'm the co-host of Khalid. We're just speaking with you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, all right, okay. Yeah, it's actually basically the organizer were Family Link. Probably, I mean, they're from Oxford, and they have produced, material, and that is in the written form, which is available on Amazon, and people can buy from them as well. So we basically use their material because that's referenced, and then we use that.
Yeah, it's in the public domain. It's been verified. It's people are free to just don't discuss it as if it's the only way of doing it, and that there are other. This is just one that chimes with you and your interests and your values. I think the question might be about harm and potential harm. So if it was passing off views which were potentially harmful to a child, like, for example, corporal punishment, then that could be seen as something which is, not up to date with the values that are consistent across society. And that's the kind of view that Ofcom would take. So it's just making sure that, you can, there are different views out there, and there are progressive views and conservative views. And it's not to say that they shouldn't both be discussed, but it's that they should be I would find that difficult to give. I don't think personally my values about corporal punishment for children are that it is a clear issue of the human rights of the child to be free from violence. So I would justify a discussion about a more progressive view of parenting and education on that basis. But I would also back it up with some discussion and some evidence based on that.
We won't be touching on that side. I mean, obviously, because we're just
I'm pushing it to the extreme to kind of to figure out what I'm thinking.
Another thing, I mean, just want to know, obviously, we are just going as a volunteer and just, sharing this the parenting skills. But we are running in the community these programs. These are 10 weekly programs. Is it okay, because we are not paying anything towards radio or anything? Is it okay if we just mention our email so people can contact us, because we'll be running our programs, 10 weekly programs?
Just be clear, if there's a charge, just be clear with people that you can find out the details of how much it'd cost on the website, that kind of thing, or by contacting you. If you said this was free, this is a free of charge service, and it wasn't, then you'd run into trouble. But if you say, we run this, we offer advice about this and support, there is a small fee to be paid. Just be clear upfront about it. Don't try and mislead the audience that what's being offered is it doesn't have that. You're not coming on to. It's like, I mean, I run my own services. When I go onto the radio, I'm providing that for free. I'm not being paid to do that. But if I was to talk about services, say training services that I offer, then I'd say, this is my commercial activity, and you can find information. It's really great to have the opportunity, but invite other people to share their commercial opportunities as well in that way. So there's nothing wrong with talking about what's available out there commercially, as long as you don't give undue prominence to one person's active business, if you like. Okay. The thing that you miss with that is actually it's the opportunity then for people to come on and pay for advertising and sponsorship.
No, it's actually, I mean, the courses which we're running, basically, they're virtually free. The only thing is basically we are, asking them to buy the book, which probably they can go and buy from anywhere.
Yeah, just tell them that there's a book available. Don't say go and buy the book. Just say we know we're the authors of this book. If they can make their own mind up whether they want to buy it or not. Yeah.
Okay.
We've got a DJ. I'm really rubbish at pronouncing names.
It's Alvina, Rob.
Oh, hello.
I was just going to ask you, there's no harm in the presenters from the parenting group to include their emails within their presenter profiles on our website?
No, that's fine. Yeah, that's okay. They're okay with that.
Right. Okay. That's something obviously we'll clear with Brother Khalid then.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, it's accountability. People know who to come to. You're saying who your name is. You're being transparent. And if people want to follow it up, I'd suggest that's fine. If people, I always ask at the end of when I'm doing something is if people want to get in touch with you, how do they?
Right, so it might be useful then putting other further links within the profile of the presenters and stuff.
Yeah, and on the website, that's there's a difference between what you can do on the website and what you can do online on air.
Radio.
But you can give email addresses out and contact details on air as well. If you want to follow this up, you can get more advice at this from our guests, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's fine.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you.
Right, I'm aware of the time. If there's no other questions, I shall let you all go and relax in front of, be with your family, relax in front of Netflix, wherever it is that we do at this time in the evening. Go and look at the stars, I think, because it's been a clear couple of nights, the last few nights. I've got it recorded. I'll pass it over once I'll do a quick edit on it. And if there's anything else that you want to follow up on, I'll kind of pass on my email address as well. But thank you very much, everybody, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rob.
You're welcome. Thank you for sticking out.